welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today. No. We're talking about action-packed fantasy. That's all the action. It's happening. It's packed.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
No, that's it. That's what
That's it.
We're talking about action-packed fantasy right now. Picture like the chang chang of metal clashing, and then maybe some background was and the ching ching. That's what it is.
Well said, Charles. I'm excited to get into this. I know a lot of folks, the recommendation episodes are some of their favorites. Also gives us a chance to get some feedback from the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. And a lot of folks came out to contribute to our call for, hey, what would you folks think when it comes to action-packed fantasy? And we got decent amount of responses. Won't be able to get to all of them, but appreciate everyone who commented on that. And Charles will mostly be focusing on providing our recommendations, many of which were brought up by these wonderful folks, so that makes it easy. And it's what it sounds like. I mean, when we hear action-packed, I think most of us have a good idea of what we're talking about here. We're probably talking about a lot of fighting going on, maybe some big battles and wars and just these big epic scenes, but also some of the more intimate 1v1 type fighting might be going on in these. Anything that just keeps the viewer ready. I mean, it could be even big chase scenes or things like that could fit into it. Anything like that. It doesn't just have to be fighting. Anything that fits the mold of a lot of action and that kind of entertainment.
Well said, Dylan. I also think there's a kind of a focus on the entertainment value also that would make something action-packed. Some more dramatic books maybe they may still come up in our action-packed recommendations, but to me, I'm thinking if it's going to be packed, then it's going to keep going. It's going to be super fun and entertaining, and lots of these great exciting moments are going to be happening throughout. It's not drama, huge, epic, best battle scene I've ever read. That's not what we're here. This is action-packed. Every moment, non-stop. That's what we're here to discover today.
I mean, you could think of something like Malazan, right? That could be something has a huge epic. Well, I'm saying for an example of what you're talking about, which is a huge epic with some of the biggest, most intense battles that you're ever going to read in fiction. But at the same time, those are few enough and far between enough, at least in the early books that we've read, where they might have some of the most epic battle scenes, but I would not call it action-packed.
It's got the action, doesn't have the packed.
Yes, packed implies it is frequent throughout. And we tried to meet that here, and it should be some great books that can just keep you entertained, keep that fun coming. And it doesn't mean they're lacking when it comes to all the, character work and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of these which have character work, have drama, but they won't leave you hanging when it comes to providing that entertainment factor.
Not stingy on the action. So, Dylan, I'm excited. Let's not delay this anymore. Let's start talking about some books. Would you like to do the honors and get us started with a good action-packed fantasy book recommendation?
Okay. Well, let's let's just do it, Charles. Let's just talk about Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Uh-huh.
I mean, it feels so
The Final
basic.
Empire being the first
Right,
book.
yeah. Mistborn, The Final Empire, Brandon Sanderson. We all know so much about him probably at this point. But this book, Charles, when I think about action-packed fantasy, the first one that comes to mind for me is Mistborn. As basic a pick as it is, it's
Yeah.
because it fits the category so well. And I mean, one of the really cool things about Mistborn for anyone who's not super familiar with it,
We're going to recommend it. We may as well like talk about it, you know?
yeah, just a bit because it's such a big one. It's a story with an amazing magic system that propels almost like a video game style action packed fantasy where characters can use, like, they each have their own individual like powers. Like, they can burn metals that they ingest in order to activate these powers. And our main character, Vin, it's not spoilery, right, Charles, to talk about Vin in this way?
I don't think so.
Let's just talk about Kelsier, who is Vin's mentor. He is an example of a Mistborn, the titular Mistborn, if you will, and he has access to all of these different metals that he can burn and use all of these different powers, many of which allow them to like push against something metal and basically use that to fly for all intents and purposes. They can do things then like shoot coins.
The
at
Goodreads
people and
review
damage
does
them
not
that
consider
way.
anything
They
around
can-
Vin a spoiler, by the way.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Well, that's usually what we use. So Vin, the main character, is a Mistborn coming into her powers, mentored by Kelstier. So it almost has the feel, I would say, of a video game, and you start to get this like tutorial style, like, well, Kelsey's going to teach you how to do this, and then let's go and you're going to learn this kind of power from like, let's say, Ham, who can burn pewter and become like super strong. You're going to learn that power from Ham, and it's like I don't know why it hasn't been made in the video game, because it's like structured in that way, the Final Empire is. But yeah, you've basically got like fantasy world superheroes flying around and fighting in midair and doing those kind of things.
It's the pacing, it's the spectacle, it's the stakes. Yeah, the magic system just lends itself so well to being action packed. And if you haven't read this series and you want something focused on action and entertainment and pacing, then like this is the first book. We're going to talk about a lot of great books, but read this one if you haven't. Like, be rest assured, like, this is a good one to start with. You won't be disappointed.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of content we've had talking about Mistborn, Charles. So let's go on to your first recommendation. What comes to mind for you?
So what comes to mind to me is another very popular book, and it just so happened to be like our March Madness winner for all of our books that we read last year. I'm talking about The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. And to me, this book is action-packed because it's all about a fighter who's just so hell-bent on becoming stronger in a world where everyone's fighting and the world is at war. And there's so many great action scenes. If you're someone who's into like power scaling, which is like a weird niche thing that I'm into, you know, like Dragon Ball Z or whatever. It's like, this is in my final form, boom, 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 and everyone's just getting stronger and stronger till they're like flying around, blowing up planets. This is the perfect book for that. You know, I've just, the back of the book kind of synopsis is you have this character named Tao from, he's called Giftless, humble beginnings, you know, the lowest caste of society. He's got this chance to rise in the ranks just by being the best fighter. So even though the whole world is kind of against him and has treated him unfairly, his quest for, you know, revenge and vengeance is like, he fixates on it and he dedicates himself to becoming this great fighter, and the lengths that he goes to become the greatest swordsman to ever live. you have to read this to believe it. It's rather insane. But, this book gets compared to Gladiator a little bit because there's a lot of like Gladiator games style moments in this where all these fighters are put through these games as a way to train themselves. So you get a ton of that. But there's also moments where they're actually at war and are fighting, and there's supernatural elements that come into it. A little bit of horror kind of comes into it as well. So for me, for an action-packed fantasy book, like that is an excellent choice.
It's definitely an excellent choice, Charles. As you said, it was crowned our favorite read of the last year. And that was because it kept us so entertained. Like you said, I mean, the premise is this guy seeking revenge by becoming the greatest fighter that he possibly can. And the plot doesn't stray too far from that. It's a very focused plot, and I think that's also what helps it in being such an action-packed fantasy, is that there's a lot of other books that have someone with a goal like that or trying to become really powerful, but I won't say they get bogged down in the character work or the relationships or whatever else, because that's stuff that we love in lots of books. But when it comes to recommending action-packed fantasy, you have to take that into account, that this book fits a category so well because all of that other stuff takes a little bit of a back seat, and it's because Evan Winter has created this character of Tao who, to him, everything takes a back seat to his training, to him becoming a great warrior. And we don't just get training, we get him actually using those skills to great effect. This is one of the best recommendations, and it was definitely on my list as well to give. A good one, Charles.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was one too, Charles, I'll say, to go to the recommendations offered by Twitter. That one came up so much. I mean, let me make sure to credit some folks who had similar ideas to us here. We have I totally lost it just now. This is riveting podcast.
It can be hard to navigate sometimes.
Back when it was Twitter and not X, this was another world, Charles. But now we are in Elon Musk's world, and
yeah, right.
I don't know what we can do about the fact that it's just not the same, Charles.
Me neither. I guess. Can I throw out just an obvious one that doesn't need too much time, like Game of Thrones? To me,
so do you think it's packed?
I think it's packed, dude. I mean, it's been years since I've read it, but so much. It is an epic fantasy, so you would think like the pacing, it's not going to be action all the time. But even when it's not action, there's like some sort of mature content happening every other page. You're like, whoa. like there's certainly a lot to enjoy with Game of Thrones. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But it's like you're listening to a fantasy podcast. I don't need to recommend Game of Thrones to you. Shall I keep going, or are we?
Let's credit a couple because I found it. P.L. Stewart, who's an author, he brought up Rage of Dragons alongside a few others. We have Rage of Dragons brought up by Robert Olson, who described as the most action-packed that Robert has ever read. Lynn of the Night Court, Rage of Dragons. Like, this is one that just comes up constantly. So it's also a newer work, so it's on the tip of a lot of people's tongue. So thank you everyone who came out and mentioned Rage of Dragons. We definitely are on the same page about that.
It's like 7 years ago, but I guess that's new in the realm of fantasy. But
is it really 7 years ago?
According to Goodreads, it came out in 2017, but that could have been when it was like independently published and then it was picked up again.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, but that's what it says, first published.
Either way.
Yeah. Either
I mean,
way.
it's modern. It's more recent than like Mistborn, which
Should we get into
Mistborn's
some
getting.
modern fantasy? Because I think we need
Sure,
to talk
throw some
about. You want to talk
modern.
about The Last Shield?
Oh, this is as modern as it gets.
See,
And
we recommended some obvious ones that everyone's read, but what about recommending one that you can't read yet? It's like,
well, someone did. Someone else got the advanced copy, Charles, because we did get. I was like, Caitlin Lloyd on Twitter said "The Last Shield" by Cameron Johnston, alongside "Best Served Cold" by Abercrombie and a couple others. But I'll say, yeah, Charles, we were lucky enough to get the advanced copies of "The Last Shield" by Cameron Johnston, and it's presented as a gender flip Die Hard. And I'll say, once this book gets going, I mean, the action just does not stop. It totally lives up to that. Didn't you think so?
Oh, 100%. I mean, we were having a blast with it, and to me, what helps keep its like action packed kind of the stamp of approval here is it's the Die Hard scenario. It's kind of like Cameron Johnson builds the scenario where it is all action all the time for a majority of the book. And that's kind of what makes it so much fun. And we had the esteemed honor of being able to provide a blurb for this because we got to read it early enough, and we called it a breathtaking fantasy thrill ride, didn't we, Dylan?
That's exactly what we did. So we're crossing our fingers, hoping that blurb makes it into the actual physical copy of the book. But we have
fantasy in print, baby.
Yeah, we have made it into the Amazon page. At least last I checked. Meaning
right.
not just like a review, but like if you look at the like what people have been saying about the book as like what the publisher puts. You will see Friends Talking Fantasy podcast on there, so that was something really cool for us. And we're grateful to the folks at Angry Robot who sent that advanced copy our way. And one of the reasons I knew it would be a great fit is that I had read Maleficent 7 by Cameron Johnston, and that one's really action-packed too. It's kind of a if you like Kings of the Wild, which maybe we'll get into in a little bit, it's almost like that getting the gang back together, like in Kings of the Wild case, getting the band back together, like this old adventuring crew. But in Maleficent 7, it's with villains instead of with more heroic figures. So it's a lot of fun and it's entertaining. It's funny. Cameron Johnson does a good job of balancing humor with action. And we also had him throw in a comment on our on our post asking for action-packed recommendations.
Cameron Johnson?
He did, yeah, Cameron Johnson.
Oh, nice.
We had he had, even though he's totally deserving of a recommendation of his books, he restrained. He's too humble.
So modest. So humble.
He said that there's always Legend of Waylander, I assume. It says Legend or Waylander, but assume he got auto-corrected, by David Gemmell, or the Conan story collections, which he called classics.
I've never read Conan, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is one that, I don't know, I just kind of passed over. It seems kind of pulpy. But if Cameron Johnston is throwing it out there as a classic, we have to pay attention.
For real. And if any of that sounded exciting to you, don't forget to check out The Last Shield in August 2024, August 13th. So check that one out for sure. And any of his recommendations as well. That's exciting. Look at us pitching some stuff that's cutting edge, dare I say. We're talking about action-packed fantasy here. Lots of cutting going on. While we're talking about new books, what do you think about the Judas Blossom, Stephen Aaron? Do you think we can throw that in the mix?
I think that's a great fit. Another Angry
this
Robot
is a
book there.
It's family and war collide in this thrilling and bloody reimagining of the Mongol Empire's invasion of Persia. And if you know anything about the Mongolian Empire, is that there's a lot of, I guess you could call it action-packed stuff going on in their history. A lot of the book, the first book, The Judas Blossom by Stephen Arion, is just devoted to sieges and battles and like intrigue, and all of a sudden we're in a room and someone's attacking us and we've got to like survive. So much of that happens throughout the book, and it's couched in this sort of historical fiction in a very interesting time and setting and culture of people where there's just so much dominating and sieging going on. So if you're interested in more of the historical fiction angle that's not your typical European historical fiction, this would be a really good one to consider. And book 2, The Blood-Dimmed Tide, is coming out like probably by the time this airs, it comes out July 9th, 2024. So cutting edge fantasy yet again.
Yeah, Charles, definitely some of the most exciting new fantasy on the horizon when it comes to the sequel to the Judas Blossom. So we're talking about some new stuff. I'll talk about something that's relatively new here, Charles. Let's talk about The Final Strife. Which is the first book. We can talk about the Ending Fire trilogy overall by Sar El-Arifi. And this series, something that came to mind for me, we talk about this every time we talk about The Final Strife, but it's another book that we got the advanced copy of, and we're not just trying to humble brag with all the advanced copy talk. The reason I bring it up is that we ended up getting these e-reader copies of it that it wasn't super easy to know how long the book was. Like, we're just looking at like percent done with the book. And I remember I was like almost done with the book, probably like at least 75% done. Charles was well on his way as well, probably around there. And I ended up texting Charles being like, do you know how long this book is? And we're like, it feels like it's like a 400-page book. Like, we had no idea. 608 pages. That's the length of that book. It reads so easy and quick, and like, it's got a lot of depth. Like, it covers, it has a, it's like a Middle Eastern influence setting, and it is a like really interesting new world with a lot of world building, and it's got great prose written by Sarah, and at the same time it just reads super easy, which is a really hard thing to do. And it reads easy because I think a lot of it is the character work. I mean, because you have a main character who is just always ready to take the initiative, and that makes such a difference, these kind of books. I mean, we've got Scylla, who is just ready to fight at the at a moment's notice, and she's a member of a kind of at the start of the story, a little bit of like a defunct resistance revolution to this caste system that has held people down, but she's like getting by and like fighting rings and stuff. She's also kind of on the edge of her her last nerve all the time, because she's like in withdrawal constantly from drugs. And it's like the action is of course fighting, and there's also a sort of a set of trials that include combat in it as well.
Yeah.
But it's a book where some of the action is just like the aggressiveness of Scylla as a character in her interactions as well. And it's got a great romance plotline to it as well. So this one keeps you on the edge of your seat in a variety of ways.
well said, and I do think you had touched on it. Like that structure of there's a competition going on where people are competing and fighting each other, and all of that really helps keep it action packed, right? Where it's just like every once in a while throughout the book, something with focus on action is going to happen with these characters who lend themselves towards violence and intrigue and all of that. So worthy recommendation for this subject. Dylan, I don't want to go too far without talking about Joe Abercrombie.
That would be criminal.
That would be criminal. And there's a lot of books out there in the first law world. I think we're both in agreement on which one best qualifies for action-packed.
Yes. I would say The Heroes. I assume that's where you're going.
I guess we're not.
Are you going best served cold?
Yeah, I was going to go best served cold. But The Heroes is also action-packed, too. I was going to say it's one of those two. To me, best served cold kind of lends itself maybe a little more because it's like, okay, I'm going to kill. I have a list of people that I'm going to kill. And then each chapter is me going and killing a person. What The Heroes is about
each chapter.
Battling. Well, pretty much. Yeah. But with The Heroes, it's like the waiting in between the battles, and the battles it has a great battle scene in it, and it's kind of like a hallmark in Abercrombie's style that kind of took off from The Heroes. But you could go with either one. I would say they're both standalone.
I think best
books,
served cold is fair. I'll also say, Charles, you know who else thought it would be criminal not to go with this? We had a chime in from a Twitter user whose name was Glockta Unleashed.
Oh, God. And there's one character that does not need to be unleashed.
Keep that guy on a leash.
Yeah, seriously.
I have to say, I haven't been saying people's handles, but I have to say this one because it's Nikomokoska88.
Oh, so there
props
you go.
to
the
you, Glockta Unleashed.
Fortune, my friend.
Yes, and they said The Last Argument of Kings, Best Served Cold, and The Hero. So they went full Abercrombie, true to form, but the ones they chose seemed to align well with what we were thinking too. So go on with your Best Served Cold.
You gotta recommend the standalones though, because it's hard to recommend like the third book in a trilogy. And even though I would recommend reading Abercrombie in publication order, and that it's technically a standalone, but you should read the books that came out before it. You could just dive right into Best Served Cold. And, it's still very likely that it's going to be a movie someday. So another great reason to read Best Served Cold as well. And I mean, of all the ones, you're going to pick the action-packed one to make the movie on. So I feel like that's something to consider.
I think now that I hear you talking about it, even though my gut instinct went Heroes because it is like military fantasy.
Heroes is a great choice.
I think you're right that Best Served Cold is the most action packed, and it goes back to that packed part of it where it's like you're pretty much constantly
of the story where it's like I'm going down a list.
It's so
of
much more
I
focused.
Yeah.
Than The Heroes. It is just okay. We can easily digest that she's trying to go down this list, and it's very. I compare it to Kill Bill a lot.
Yeah.
It is a woman going out there and trying to take revenge on everyone who's wronged her one by one, and it is it's a complex take, as Abercrombie always does. On the idea of the revenge story. Of course, there's a lot of subversion going on, but Abercrombie never lets the subversive elements overtake the entertainment and humor and all the things that makes his writing so great. And probably even more than all that, the character work. I mean, his characters are as good as it gets in the genre. So to be getting action-packed on top of all of those amazing things about Abercrombie's writing, I mean, Best Served Cold is a fantastic recommendation. And definitely, there's action in all of Abercrombie's books, but I would say, the blade itself is definitely, slower when it comes to that kind of stuff. You get, skirmishes.
Even in Before Their Hang, there's a lot of like traveling and
Yes.
journeying where it's more like funny. It's not like action packed, but there's some great moments throughout. But yeah, I think, Dylan, it comes down to what you were saying, the structure of the story here that lends itself to the action packed recommendation for sure. So check it out if you haven't. Prepare yourself for the movie that will hopefully be made. Odds are pretty good so far.
With Rebecca Ferguson, right, Charles? I mean, who is she plays the mother of Paul Atreides in Dune. And she's also in, I think, like, was it Silo or something like that? Another show recently. So she's active, and I mean, it doesn't get a lot bigger than Dune these days. So yeah, we got a big star on board for that. And
here's hoping.
Yeah, here's hoping that happens. I mean, I haven't heard any updates. We'll have to try to get Joe back on the show again and and try to press him for
it. Good friend Joe.
Yeah, it's our good friend Joe. Hopefully he doesn't, he might got Hollywood on us. Who knows at this point? But
well, we got to get him back on before the show starts filming. Or the movie starts filming. Because we may never see him again. But I like to think he would stay humble. I don't think his public persona is very much not humble. So but, we'll see. Let's hear another rec. I think we got a few more in us.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I wanted to recommend The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. That's one that, especially that first book, I would say, is just constantly moving. The characters are very different, but a similar reason I was kind of getting at with Sila and the final strife. Like, Rin is just relentless, the main character of this book. And for those who don't know a lot of the Poppy War, it is based on the 20th century China. Like, conflicts are taking place with kind of stand-in for Japan, and it's oftentimes called like grimdark fantasy, and it is pretty intense action throughout, also brought on by a magic system that I can't get too much into when it comes to like possible spoilers here. But I'll just say that we've got Rin, it starts with an academy setting, and even in the academy there is lots of fighting going on. There is learning how to fight. There is another trial of almost kind of like a a DBZ style tournament at one point in the among the students there, and then there is a whole period of like constant action once there's some military fantasy elements of it, because there is this war looming in the background. So once that comes to the forefront, it really takes off when it comes to the action. And it's another one that when we're reading this book, we were like, geez, like this thing just flies. Like, even though it's a long book, you get through it quickly because it just keeps moving. So that's my favorite of any of R.F. Kuang's work. She's written a lot of stuff at this point, some of it much bigger than the Poppy War now. Like, I definitely would say Babel and Yellowface both have taken off a lot bigger than her first work, but to me, this was my favorite.
I would agree. And one of the things in our episodes where we talked about the book in detail were the pacing. Oh my gosh, like just the narrative, not even necessarily the action that's happening, which it is action packed, but just like the way that the narrative, something is always happening, momentum is always building in that story. So another great reason to tie it into that action packed recommendations. And like, speaking on just these super proactive action focused characters, we got to talk about Jorg, and we got to talk about Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, because I mean, this is one of these super popular grimdark novels that have been out for a while that I don't feel like we need to get into too much because it's so popular. But
Yeah.
here's also a character whose proactiveness is off the charts, and he's always just like, oh, I'll just kill this person real quick and then move on and fight this person real quick and go and fetch this thing in a dangerous place real quick. And it's a relatively shorter book as well, so I just feel like it's just constantly moving, and this your character is just off the walls insane, and so you're just thrown into this world of nonstop action. It's like, oh my god, I can't believe he did that, or I can't believe he got away with that, and like, this character's dying now, this character's dying, I'm gonna walk up and kill this character. Like, it's always happening in Prince of Thorns, one of those classic grim dark golden era kind of fantasy novels that if you haven't read and you're looking for action packed and you love grimdark, like, yo, check it out.
Yeah.
Plus, friend of the show, Mark Lawrence.
Yeah, we love Mark's work. I was even thinking about it'd be so easy to throw numerous Mark Lawrence books in there. So I was like, we could spend this whole episode talking about them. I'll give a shout out to Red Sister and Book of Ancestor, but I think, which is my favorite of Lawrence's books, but I love Prince of Thorns and that whole series, and I'll say because of that, your character and how he's another one would use the word Machiavellian to describe. Like, he will do whatever it takes, and oftentimes that means violence. And that violence and that willingness to just do it leads to a ton of action in Prince of Thorns, and I would say it's Lawrence's most action-packed work among numerous action-packed novels that he's published. So good call there, Charles. I'm going to go for one that is one that I didn't think of right away, and then was brought up by Jody from WS Book Club, Witty and Sarcastic Book Club, and it was Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. So I was kind
witty
of
and sarcastic, and not surprised they recommended Kings of the Wild.
That's very fair. And it's easy to start thinking about the more like grimdark and very like violent feeling novels when it comes to action-packed fantasy. But then Jody brought this up, and I was like, you know what? Like, Kings of the Wild is kind of constantly having them like fighting monsters, and like there's almost like a gladiator type sequence in this one too, and they are like getting
it's
into
like
all
an
these like
odyssey of
hijinks
sorts,
and like
where it's just like different characters with different abilities and different settings, and it has that kind of down the rabbit hole sort of flow to it.
Yeah, so it was an interesting one, but I was like thinking about it, I was like, there is constant action going on. It's just sometimes because it is a lot more lighthearted and funny, it didn't come to my mind right away. So anyway, for folks who aren't super familiar with Kings of the Wild, it's the premise is this kind of get the band back together. It uses a lot of what's the best way, like homages to like
symbolism,
to the 70s rock scene, and it's something that you could enjoy just as like they're almost like a D&D party who are now like older and out of shape, and then they have to all get back together to save one of the like the leader of the group's daughter, who's in this like city under siege. And it's got a lot of fun because of the like silly, like, oh no, like we used to be the best adventurers, but now we're old, like that kind of stuff. And then you got this extra layer of enjoyment for folks like me to some extent, but even more someone like Charles, who's like a gigantic fan of the 70s music scene. You get a ton of fun out of some of the like pretty subtle parallels at times that are in there, and it's just written in the amazing just clever, humorous voice of Nicholas Eames that we love so much. So highly recommend that one.
Cherish it. Highly recommend
appreciate that thought that I didn't really have on my own. So thank you, Jody.
Yeah.
It's that's
Thank
a really
you, Jody.
good
Great recommendation. Dylan, there's one last book, at least for me, that I want to make sure gets recommended. This one, it's been recommended a lot by me on our recommendation episodes throughout the years. But I also feel like it has had a cult following, and I see murmurs of it constantly. And I feel like people who have been watching this episode and just waiting for it are like going to feel vindicated that I'm saying it, and then most other people will have never heard of it. I'm talking about Heroes Die by Matthew Stover, book 1 of the Acts of Cain. And this is, to me, like one of the quintessential action fantasy books, and one that I've been holding off putting on the show for whatever reason. I would love to read it on the show sometime soon. It's been years since I've read it, but to me, what draws me to this story is that it's a book that is like, its themes are around action itself. So there's kind of this meta thing of, yes, this character, he's what's called and he's basically an actor, right? He's a famous superstar, right? Celebrity actor. And what happens is he's able to, for the sake of entertainment, become a character in a fantasy world, and they constantly throw stuff at him and he's trying to survive, and then there's all this intrigue that kind of builds up on top of it. So like, literally, this whole thing is kind of contrived to be entertaining for the masses, and that's what throws him into this crazy plot around this. He's almost like become in the middle of this game between these two worlds, and one is this traditional fantasy high magic situation, and one is modern. People are watching it for entertainment, and so sometimes they'll spice it up by throwing stuff at them. Like, let's just add a few mountain lions into this moment just to see what'll happen. We need to spice it up. There's like producers like guiding this to be more entertaining. So that compounded with the fact that we're exploring the theme of violence, like, as a form of entertainment, it creates just this really fun story. I consider it a standalone, even though there's 2 other books that are part of this Acts of Cain, but I feel like they were written after this book became really popular, and they were like, okay, let's write some more. But on its own, highly recommend it. And if you haven't read it yet, and this is something that I would recommend, as just, you won't be sorry. It's really fun. It's from like the late 90s, 1998, and so it's a little more vintage now, but still very popular. I see it get murmurs of it constantly online, like on Reddit threads and in our own social media channels. People always come out when I invoke Heroes Die. People are like, yes, Heroes Die. So one of these days we'll have to do a book discussion.
Your partner in crime in this respect on social media appears to be Drew McCaffrey. It seems like he's always coming out of the woodwork anytime Heroes Die. Anytime there's an opportunity to bring up Heroes Die.
There are dozens of us.
Yeah,
Dozens.
Exactly. Yeah. So he said fantasy action simply does not get better than Heroes Die. So that is true, Charles. And I always think of you and Drew as the 2 folks who are leading the charge when it comes to Heroes Die, and that should get more respect.
I see you.
Yeah.
Let's get it on FTF. Let's do a book discussion.
Yeah. I've read it too, and I'll say it totally lives up to everything Charles is saying. He always just says it much better than I could. I can feel his passion, but I'm totally on board. One of the best recs I could think of when it comes to just action-packed fantasy. It was one of the first I thought of. So Charles, can we lightning round the rest of these and just
Yeah,
and then play that sweet outro music? I'm
let's
thinking,
lightning round, you know?
yeah. So, because there's a few I want to at least just get into the, speak
The
them
mix, you know?
into this episode,
This is going to
but
be an
won't go into
action-packed
depth.
segment
Yes.
here of rapid-fire recommendations.
Yeah, so I'll say that Elaney, who's a member of Before We Go blog, who, I've talked to her about her last name, and I don't know if I can say it right, but I'm going to try. Elaney Argyro, who is and she listened. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what the feedback is. But she brought up some, including Ashes of the Sun by, I think, Django Wexler, who I've been wanting to read, but also Play of Shadows by Sebastian de Castell. And that made me think, I'm reading the Greatcoat series right now, and I'm like, his action is so good in that, and it is pretty constant. So I want to say the Greatcoat series by Sebastian de Castell. And I brought that up to Elaney, and then she said the way he writes action is easily my top favorite of all time, and makes sense given his stuntman background. So I was like, oh,
the
that makes
man
total
is
sense.
an action-packed kind of guy.
Exactly. So you want action-packed fantasy from a stuntman, and you also want some swashbuckling fun. We got into this in a different episode, so just check out our spoiler-free recommendation for Trader's Blade by Sebastian de Castell, the first book. But you want a stuntman out there writing you some great fantasy with witty dialogue, swashbuckling fun. That's the way to go.
Perfect.
Yes. Also, I'll say that we had Green Team Podcast, who we love, bring up Red Rising. Charles, you've read Red Rising. How do you feel that fits the action-packed fantasy?
I feel like it fits it well. It's science fiction technically, but I don't split hairs that
I think
much,
it just splits them.
Yep. So, yeah, it's a good series. It kind of was like I think of it like Hunger Games, kind of, where it's this like classism rise against the overlords, down with the government, uprising kind of situation. But it's got all the cool space gear. There's always like lasers going off and ships flying around, and there's intrigue and there's espionage and all that kind of fun stuff. So I'd give it to him. Yeah.
All right. And then, Charles, another one that we're going to have to run through you is Laura from Our Pod. Said The Sword of Kaigen, which I always hear is one brought up as like, okay, for example, it gets brought up a lot before you read it as like, oh, this will be a good one for hashtag make Charles cry, because as everyone knows, Charles has never cried from a book. So this is like always talked about as a super tragic, sad book. Do you feel like it was action-packed as well?
That's interesting. I feel like I'm in the same position you were in when you were recommended Kings of the Wild, because it's not something I would have traditionally thought of as action-packed. It's not where my mind would go. If you're like, hey, what's like a sad, dramatic fantasy book that's like super poignant and like one spiffbo, I'd be like, oh, well, it's sort of Kaigen for sure. But I can see where the rec comes from. The magic system and is based in this like elemental combat. Think of like The Last Airbender, where like our main heroes can manipulate water, and there's enemies that can manipulate fire, and they're at war and they're fighting, and you can imagine how that goes. So there's definitely a lot of great action and a really fun elemental magic system involved. You just don't think of it because there's also like this really tragic family drama happening and like war drama. So this is a lot of like really sad stuff going on. But in between all of that is certainly a lot of action-packed moments. So yeah, it's a great rec for anyone that hasn't read it, and fans of like Poppy War and even like The Last Airbender. We've mentioned some other historical fiction like the Judas Blossom is definitely right in there with all of those. So definitely check it out if you've read any of those others and haven't read Sword of Kaigen.
Well said, Charles. Yeah, I also, that makes me think you gotta recommend a fellow finalist of the self-published fantasy blog off, Spiffbo of 2019 or 2020, whenever it was, that Sword of Kaigen one, because there's also the finalist Daughter of Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs, which was super action packed, and that's one
it's
that
a first person narrative, like it's also like elemental fantasy, right? Present tense.
Elemental fantasy with a great magic
more
system.
Action packed than present tense, like I'm flying around.
No, it's like in the moment. Yeah, it's Levi Jacobs is a wonderful a friend of the show, though. It makes me feel like we should give him an email or something to get him back on.
It's been a while.
It has been a while, right?
He's a busy man, though. You know, he's writing books
man.
like every year, and then he's got his fruit truck. He's a busy guy.
We should shoot him an email, though. And anyway, point being, that book is... It had us actually being like, this is great for fans of Mistborn, and that should tell you a lot when it comes to the like awesome action written in this book. So check that one out. And then we had another Kane Williams recommended, among other books, but a couple that stuck out to me, the Bloodthorn Saga, starting with the Shadow of the Gods. I mean, you take one look at the cover of that book with the giant dragon on it, beautiful the action starts there, just taking a look at the scale of that thing. And I'll say that John Gwynne writes some of the most like cinematic feeling battles. And he also has experience like reenactment and things like that, which can fuel some of the realistic feeling of his battles, but he never loses the entertainment factor. And we're doing constant battles against monsters and skirmishes. So that's a great one.
Yes.
And yeah, Charles, feel free to add if you want. But
no, I think you've done a good job. I'm just looking at my bookshelf here, but I think we've captured a lot of them. I'll say like N.K. Jemisin wrote like a pretty action-focused series called The City We Became and The World We Make, I think is the second one. It's a duology. There's a lot of action in that, but it's like an urban fantasy where this boroughs of New York take on these avatars, and they're able to use elements of the city to fight these, what are they called? Esque monsters. The horror writer, the famous horror writer, those squid-like characters, the Cthulhu's.
Oh, jeez, give me 1 second.
That like she invokes that person on purpose, and it is fun and action packed and funny and. You know, it reads like an action movie, so I'd recommend that.
Lovecraftian,
yes,
right?
Lovecraftian.
There we go.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're literary commentators. We know what the word Lovecraftian means. So definitely get some Lovecraftian elements in the mix here with the action-packed fantasy. Looking at my other books, those are some of the big ones. I think I'll leave it at that for now, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to leave it with. I mean, N.K. Jemisin. How do you top anything written by N.K. Jemisin? I think that's pretty much what we have to offer on this episode.
Hugos and Tulane alum. It doesn't get any more action packed than that.
Yeah, and graduate of. She was in psychology in some way.
A student of psychology.
I mean, a practicing counselor, I believe. So,
we're always students in life, you know.
Well said, Charles. Well, I've learned a lot from you today and your wonderful recommendations, and I hope that our listeners have too. Thank you all to thank you to everyone who contributed on social media. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of you, but all of your recs were read and appreciated, and we love our listeners, we love our followers, and we really are grateful when they
and Glockta Unleashed,
get involved.
You calm down now. Don't go crazy. That username scares me, okay?
Yeah, does Glockta need... I feel like... I mean, I guess Glockta kind of...
What's next? The Bloody Nine Unleashed? Let's chill for a second.
Yeah, like, did you feel the Bloody Nine was too restrained? Although the Bloody Nine, it is fair to say there were times in which he was thoroughly leashed, I guess. But unleashing him was not doing any good for anyone. So, anyway, Charles, thanks for warning. We need Casca unleashed. I don't mind unleashing Casca.
Oh my gosh,
right?
I mean, yeah, he'd be at least a little fun. But yeah, well, I think that's enough for one day. Thank you all for listening. I think we just get that outro music going.
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right, here we go.
That action-packed outro music.
Ooh, action-packed,
Battle
baby.
drums.
Battle drums. We're marching off to war, guys. Thank you all so much for listening. We greatly appreciate that. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, one of the best ways to do that is by engaging with us on social media. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and TikTok, and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end for Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than following us and engaging with us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. And to do that, just go to the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, click About, click where those stars are, and then throw us 5 of them. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That means that you can say nice things about us. You can say, hey, Charles, I'm sorry that I tried to unleash Glockta. I was going too far. You're so knowledgeable. Here's 5 stars.
That would be great.
But yeah, you don't have to do that, even though it's so appreciated, because just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
I agree, Dylan. Just listening is so much more than enough. I thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.